Hello everyone, this is Zooc and I'd like to welcome you to the first episode of Zooc's Art Emporium. This will be the art critique show, which I said I would do like 100 times and didn't. But this time I finally decided to start doing it, and it's actually quite fun. I had a bit of a good time with it. The aim of the show is to take drawings submitted by subscribers and viewers and basically do a constructive breakdown of what is wrong with them, what could be better, what is right with them, and in hopes of helping people, I guess, improve or fix their mistakes or bad habits, stuff like that. This is going to be mostly about the art, and I know at this point my channel is not so much about the art, but more about my personal shit. But it started off as an art channel, and I'd like to sort of keep it that way, somewhat. So yeah, I'm going to be trying to do this regularly, and if you guys like it, send your drawings to zoocdoesstuff@gmail.com. Zoocdoesstuff in one word, of course. And I will take a look at them. So I'm going to try to do at least one per episode. Some might go quicker, so I might do two. But for now, I'm going to try and keep it as detailed as possible without going super nuts, because I could probably talk about one drawing for 40 minutes and nobody would ever watch it again. So I'm going to try and keep it within the limit of 20 minutes and address the most important issues. So without further ado, let us start. So the first drawing is a submission sent in by a viewer called Sasha. It is a pencil drawing of Death from Darksiders 2, a character which I drew as well a long time ago in the exact same pose, which you can find on my channel, by the way, if you want to see the difference between then and how I'm going to do it now. And it's a fairly complex drawing with a lot of surfaces, a whole lot of fucking surfaces everywhere. Like this entire part here, let's lighten that up a bit. This entire part here is a fucking nightmare to draw, really. There's a lot of cloth kind of bending over itself. Thankfully, there's not a lot of musculature, but the musculature in this particular area needs a bit of work. It might just be the scan quality as well. But overall, the drawing looks very flat in some areas. Like the hand here, this part here looks pretty flat. Like this surface is separate from the rest. It looks like a very squished together box, you know? And also the handle on this weapon as well, because of how thick this highlight here is. It also looks very flat. Like this is one side and this would be another side of a squished box. So overall, the whole thing needs to just get a bit more volume so it looks round, you know, like a tube, like what it is. And also the blade, again, this might just be the scan quality, but the volume on the blade is not very good. Like this entire area is just basically dark, with the skulls kind of popping out a bit too strongly. And the edge here doesn't look like it has this volume going in, because this black area here is receded. So these are going to have like a dark edge here and another lighter edge here, because the light is coming from this direction. So it doesn't have that. So it looks just like the blade is super flat. And of course here is also an edge. So I'm not sure how the weapon looks like in reality, if it's supposed to have this side here, like the thickness of it, or if it's sharpened on this top. It looks like it's sharpened on the top edge as well, so it shouldn't have that. And here there's some problems with how the volume is defined. What else? Let's see. The bones are they just look too sharp, basically. The bones are they just need a bit more texturing and less of the sharp shadows, the very dark shadows here. And the handle as well is too overdone. It's too overdone in some areas, and the stuff is just too well defined everywhere. Like every individual strand of cloth here is too well defined. This is useful in some situations, but not always. And the whole drawing is overall too equal in terms of value. So the general consensus is that it's supposed to be light on top, because that's where the light is. And as you go down, it gets darker and darker. So all this stuff here shouldn't be that shiny, especially not the stuff under the cloth here, right? So you got the cloth flowing here, and then you got this part should not be receiving any light here at all. right? Because it's covered by the cloth, so any light coming this way is going to basically cast an entire shadow over this area, so it's going to be barely visible. Also this here, like, I guess there's two light sources here, one coming from here as well, because it's lighting up this part and lighting up the muscles here. Also another issue are cast shadows of various objects. For example, like the arm is supposed to cast a shadow on the zone underneath, and every muscle is casting a shadow on the muscle under it, which is not very well defined. The head casts a shadow over the cloth, right? And over this stuff as well. The hair casts a shadow over this stuff. The weapon handle is going to cast a shadow over the thumb because it's covering the path of the light. So every little bone is going to cast a shadow underneath it, especially if the light is coming from this side as well. Like here, you know. This edge is going to cast a shadow over the skull. Oh god, this looks like a mess now. Let's get a new layer. And, you know, like this handle is going to cast a shadow over this part as well. And it's just like the cloth is going to cast a shadow over each individual muscle here, of course. I don't get it exactly where the light is coming from. If it's coming from front and back and from the left top, because this part here in the hair is highlighted as well. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of times it's going to be atmospheric light and stuff like that, so it's not really up for nitpicking that much. But I'm going to attempt to redraw the areas which I disagree with how they were drawn and try and explain some principles and tips behind it. The first part which I'm going to be tackling is the blade of the scythe. I took a 9B pencil and darkened everything, the background around it, just so as to duplicate the conditions for the contrast and everything. So it's the same deal with the original. And what I'm going to be using to draw everything that I draw is a 2B drafting pencil. But in this case, 2B or not 2B is not the question. The question is, what drawing paper should I use? And the one that I've always recommended is the 400 series Strathmore drawing paper, because I find it provides the optimal compromise between smoothness and texture. I tend to rely a lot on the texture of paper when drawing stuff like weapons and blades and shit like that need a lot of texturing, or even bones or armor that has a lot of dents, and it just makes things a little more interesting when it's not perfectly smooth. So people that draw on A4 printer paper, I suggest like investing a little bit in a proper drawing pad, and I believe you're bound to notice some pretty significant improvements. So right now I am drawing the edge that I mentioned before that precedes the receding black part of the blade, simply because the blade is a bit skewed and is sort of facing the viewer, so that edge is going to catch even more light from the front, I suppose, or any atmospheric light. And there I'm just sort of fleshing out the black receding part just to accentuate the fact that there is an edge there. I'm just fucking obsessed with this edge, you know. I just like, I saw it and I was like, no, I have to fix it. That must be fixed. So what I do for the actual blade is hold the pencil in a non-conformist way, because that's who I am, and just sort of move my hand randomly. The highlights, I also interrupt them sometimes. The highlights on the very edges, because it's metal, it's going to have a highlight. But it doesn't need to be as thick as in Sasha's drawing, and it doesn't need to be as uniform. It can definitely vary in terms of surface it covers, just to make the image a little bit more interesting. Also, adding a lot of dents and cracks to interrupt said highlight will make them pop. And I'm adding some dark bits to the blade as well, just to signify the fact that it is bent, it's been beaten, it's been used and abused. It's just little elements of interest help a lot with drawing such as this. This is why I prefer to draw like non-smooth objects, because I just find them boring. While with these ones I can just play around and infinitely detail them and fuck with them and make them beat up and used looking. Of course, you can also add any sort of like blood or stains to the blade as well, just to make it a bit more interesting. Possibilities are endless. But you know, just focus on like trying to not make it too uniform. I think that's the main problem with Sasha's version of it in this scenario. The next problem is Sasha's scythe handle. Basically, the volume on the shape of the handle is not very well defined, and it looks flat, as I said before. And the edges of the cloth or the leather that's wrapping it, I guess it's leather, are too rounded and too gradient-like, so they're not very sharp. And also the whole thing is way too dark. So in a situation like this, I would basically just try and make it more gradual and not actually as dark as he chose. This is a mistake that I was doing before as well when I was starting off. I used to go very black in the shadows and believe that that's how it's supposed to be because it's a shadow, therefore it's black. It's not really like that. What you can do to just make it more interesting is the core shadow, you can even split it up in several parts, to the core shadow being like the really dark one, to just give it more a sense of like texture and more volume. And also as you go down the handle, you can just get darker and darker, or just make the areas less distinguished between themselves, just to show that the top part is more close to the viewer and more in the light, and the bottom part is basically like fading away. So as you can see in Sasha's version, the highlight on the edge is basically uniform throughout the whole thing, and it's way too obvious. It's just too obvious. It shouldn't be like that. I mean, I understand that he wants to use the concept of rim light, but it's a bit too overdone. Next up, I'm going to do the shoulder and chest muscles. Now, they're not bad in Sasha's example, but they look like they're made of stone or wood. They don't look very organic, and that's a problem which I've seen in many people who attempt to draw anatomy. I haven't studied anatomy. I didn't do it the proper way, but I just really like drawing monsters with muscles, so at least I've gotten somewhat better at that just through practice. So in this particular situation, the darkest point is obviously going to be under the armpit, where the muscles kind of stretch out from, at least the ones on the chest and the torso. But what I usually do with muscles in this kind of scenario is hold the pencil like I'm doing there, between basically my index finger and my ring finger. And the reason for that is that there is a smaller angle between the lead and the paper. Therefore, I get more surface area of the lead, and I can go much lighter and build it up gradually. And also, what I really like about a drafting pencil is that you can alter the length of the lead within it. And if you press down hard enough, it's going to break, but it doesn't really happen with 2B that much. It happens with the softer ones. So what I do here is fully use the texture of the paper in a situation like this to just give it as many striations and kind of organic look and feel to it as I can. And muscles are very fibrous. They have a lot of striations, so you can use those to just define individual striations and make them pop well, make them look more organic. Also, the chest muscle as well is going to cast a pretty clear shadow on the muscles underneath it. The torso muscles as well are going to be covered in a shadow, and only like the peak is gonna pop out of there. And I do a very gradual build up and very slow. And of course, the point of connection between the muscles, where they like flow into each other, are going to be the darkest parts of that whole ensemble. And then for the other ones, you just have to sort of get a feel for it. But what I would recommend to Sasha is just to try and define the striations and the different parts of the muscle better, because the biceps is not a single muscle, it's two. Same with the chest muscle. It's not just one pectoralis, it's two of them really, or two areas of them. Shoulders, the individual deltoids, the individual striations. There's a lot you can play around with these muscles to just make them look more real-like. With this cloth part, there's not that much to say, but I think what Sasha did is try and define the highlights a bit too well for the material it is. I mean, it should be fairly uniform, not so much of a difference between the dark and the light parts. And also, cloth takes very well to shading it like it's a hard surface. You don't need to be that careful with the flows and the bounce light on it, because it's a textile material. It absorbs light very well. It doesn't really bounce it, especially if it's dark. It doesn't bounce it that much upon other surfaces. But with cloth that flows in the wind like this one thing you can do to just again make it more interesting is not make it you see like that round part that I'm drawing now, not make it a single tubular part, but instead switch the core shadows, do several core shadows and make it a more flowy. I don't really know how to describe it. I guess, yeah, more flowy and more like smushed together, like bunched up, just for the sake of making it a bit more unique. Now with the bony bits, it's a bit more difficult to explain, but basically bones are very textured. Like they have a lot of actually flat surfaces on them. They're not as rounded as they usually seem. So Sasha's mistake in his drawing was illustrating some of the bones like they are very much rounded, not really defining those flat shapes very well, and there's way too many highlights on them. They're still a fairly matte material unless they're purposefully made to be shiny, so they don't necessarily need to have that many highlights. And also the core shadows on the bones are very dark and they're just not textured enough. So what I do with these, just like with muscles, is fully take advantage of the paper texture and try and just draw all sorts of squiggly lines, kind of just like let the hand move on its own, try and give them a better sense of texture. And bones usually have like some little holes in them and some dents and stuff like that. So the darkest parts of the bones are going to be the ones that are directly facing away from the light, and try and shade them as flat surfaces and not super rounded, just like I'm doing with that one there. And also the connecting parts where the bones are joining together, you know, they're going to throw cast shadows on each other depending on where the light is from. So make sure the connection points are dark and well defined, just to make more evident the idea that they're connecting over there. And also the cloth on the leg doesn't need to have that thick of a core shadow there. And also the cast shadows that the bones throw on the cloth, they should be very well defined and very clear, because it's a uniform shadow. It doesn't fade away. It's not something that fades. It's the shadow of the bone clearly defines the shape of the bone. So it has to be very well, the edge has to be very clear to show that the bone does cast a shadow on the fabric. Now, when it comes to the second scythe handle, I think it's just a bit too overdone. Like, Sasha was very persistent in defining each little core shadow of each little bone, and then separate highlights and this and that. And then he has some areas which are just black and flat. So what I would do in this situation is basically think more in terms of flat surfaces and shade it like it's more blocky and not necessarily just like one round uniform thing. The same way I'm doing with those straps there, like the top edges, which have a highlight in Sasha's version, they shouldn't have a highlight all around them, because they don't like face the light in every direction. The light is only from one, maybe two directions, and that's it. So the rest that isn't, make it dark. It doesn't need to have like a 360-degree highlight on it. And the same with those bones, they're just like, try and not overdo them. Try and like define every single small highlight on them. They just don't need that. Now with the skull here in the top part of the scythe, I think it's another one of those situations where less is more. Sasha went with a bit of a crazy detailed element. I mean, it just doesn't need to be that detailed for what it is. This is clearly like a metal sort of chromed look to it, but it doesn't need 1, 2, 3, 4 different layers of shadow. All you need to do with it, with something like this, is just like have a very clearly defined core shadow, which on chrome is going to be very sharp, come to a very sudden edge, and then gradually maybe even have two core shadows. You know what chrome looks like. The shadows just are crazy over it, and then just clearly define the areas which have the highlights, but keep the detail lower. I mean, what makes things more interesting in my view is not the amount of detail you can jam into a small thing, but just how well you can define it and make indications of details pop up, you know, like the arch of the eyes of the skull and the little teeth and the nose. You know, you're overcomplicating it with the amount of detail. You know, my skull looks, it's much simpler than yours, but it looks a bit better defined in terms of light, and it doesn't need that much detail. One last element I'm going to address is the cloth around Death's neck, because I think it's a good example of one of those situations where you can focus on another feature to accentuate it rather than core shadow, highlight, that sort of stuff. So what I did here was I chose to treat it as a hard canvas, kind of like what tents are made of. You know, when you try to bunch them up, they don't flow in curves, they more flow in kind of like straight surfaces. So what Sasha did wrong in his example is only shaded from left to right instead of up to down as well. The shadow is going to be at the points of contact where the cloth flows into each other, but you can treat it like as several flat surfaces instead of just one curved single surface, and it just makes it look more interesting, like it's a harder canvas, like it's taking the shapes of what's underneath rather than just being uniformly wound up around his neck, you know. So that's going to be it for now. These are all the things that I thought I should address. I could talk about more stuff like the gloves and the skulls and all that stuff, but I don't want to stretch it out too much. So this was the first episode of Zooc's Art Emporium. Please rate that shit if you enjoyed it. Let me know if you liked it. And send me your stuff at zoocdastuff@gmail.com if you want to be featured. See you next time. Bye-bye.